Hello and welcome to a very special Christmas episode of the Passing Through podcast, coming to you straight from Granada in southern Spain. I'm recording this episode on Christmas Eve. My partner Asha and the rest of the family are out on a brief Christmas Eve hike where I decided to stay home and just carve out some time for myself before the festivities officially begin. All morning today, I've been reading about Christmas and Christianity. And it's strange because I never really gave it much thought before. I just assumed that the birth of Christ was recorded in history, or is at least mentioned somewhere in the Bible. And to my surprise, and maybe also yours, I was shocked to find out that Christmas as an event, as a holiday, didn't even exist until hundreds of years after Jesus' death. And what's more is that the date of Jesus' birth isn't mentioned anywhere in the Holy Scriptures. And this brought me to an even deeper place of digging and wondering as I thought about how Christianity as a religion was able to come along and topple thousands of years of polytheism. And I was wondering how something like that could happen. It seems like such an exceptional event in human history. And I wanted to chew on that a little bit with you during this episode. Because for an analog, think about what it would be like in modern day America, a Christian nation, for a small sect, for a small cult to emerge and at first be hated, persecuted, to have the leader of that cult strung up on a cross and martyred, and then to persecute any remaining believers of that religion, to throw them to lions or savage animals in a coliseum, or to just torture, beat, and kill them publicly. Just depraved persecution of a people. And then in a matter of about 300 years, have that persecuted sect become not just accepted by America, but have it become the dominant religion of the country. That would be a pretty impressive feat, and yet that's what we see having happened in ancient Rome. The Romans persecuted the Christians. They killed Jesus, as the story goes. They martyred the remaining believers. The religion was outlawed. People were killed. And then, within a few hundred years, you have the emperor of Rome come out as a Christian. You have the marriage of church and state see its most formidable expression in the Roman Empire. This union was powerful enough to banish the old gods. Pagan temples were destroyed, because you have to think that for most of human history, for the large majority of human history, we were polytheistic, animistic people. And somehow this religion was able to come along, and suddenly pagan temples were being destroyed. Now it was the pagans' turn to be persecuted. And on a high level, this is the kind of stuff that I'll be talking about in this episode. So if this is equally fascinating to you, and you are also wondering how a minor sect, a minor cult, could come onto the scene and infiltrate and conquer an empire, then I think this episode is for you. So the theme of this episode is essentially investigating how old solstice traditions have influenced our modern holidays, the ones we celebrate now, like Christmas and Hanukkah. But not just Christmas and Hanukkah, right? Because the fall holiday season isn't limited to just these two. In India, there's Diwali. On December 5th, Muslims celebrate Ashura. Later, Buddhists celebrate Bodhi Day. Latin countries and Hispanic communities in the States celebrate Las Posadas. The day after Christmas, Kwanzaa begins. On the same day, Zoroastrians remember the death of Zoroaster. All over the world, people gather together as the days get shorter. Why is that? So many events happen on or around the winter solstice. The solstice in the northern hemisphere is on December 21st, and it's the shortest day of the year with the longest night. This is the day after which each night begins to get a little bit longer. And it's linked to the symbolic death and rebirth of the sun. The symbolic death and rebirth of the sun. Remember that. We'll come back to it again. Now, these ancient solstice traditions have pagan origins. When I use the term pagan here, pagan is basically another word for polytheistic, often nature-based religions. Ancient Roman, Greek, and Germanic cultures, just to name a few, were pagan. They had many gods. It was only in modern times that we've shifted from polytheism to monotheism on such a large scale with the emergence of Abrahamic religions such as Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. Before that, for the overwhelming majority of human history, humans were animists. And you might be wondering, what is animism? I've heard you mention that a few times on this podcast. And one thing I saw on Wikipedia that I liked says, although each culture has its own mythologies and rituals, animism is said to describe the most common, foundational thread of indigenous peoples' spiritual or supernatural perspectives. The animistic perspective is so widely held and inherent to most indigenous peoples that they often do not even have a word in their languages that corresponds to animism or even religion. The term animism is an anthropological construct. And I also really like Graham Harvey's definition of animism as the belief that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in a relationship with others. He goes on to say that animism is therefore concerned with learning how to be a good person in respectful relationships with other persons. So to me, in simple terms, animism is a nature-based spiritual practice, which is relational, and sees all creatures, places, objects, and phenomena as having spirit. To me, that definition is pretty workable and serviceable. And now what does this have to do with what I'm saying? I started by talking about Christmas, and then I'm talking about pagans and Romans and Greeks, and now I'm talking about the solstice and animists, and this is a lot of stuff. How are all of these things connected? Well, because we've been animists for nearly all of our history, humans have been celebrating the solstice since at least the Neolithic, roughly 10,000 BC. So for humans whose livelihood and cultures required close partnership with the natural world, the solstice offered time to reflect or time to celebrate. As we mentioned earlier, the days are getting darker, the temperature's getting colder. People are maybe spending more time together, inside. There's more to talk about. There's more to think about. It's a kind of going inward as everything around us begins to do the same. When you look at nature, the leaves have fallen off of the trees. Things are bare. There aren't many birds or animals scurrying about. And so the year is coming to a close at that time. It's a contemplative time. And as that year comes to a close, it seems only natural to want to bring in the coming year with hope and joy and a wish for bounty and prosperity and success and health and all these kind of things that we still wish each other at the close of every year. So yeah, okay. So then we can see why the solstice is an important event for people, especially if these people were agricultural or even if they were hunting, because the behavior of animals changed during the season. So this marks an important point in time during the solstice. So now, in having spoke about the solstice a bit, what does this have to do with Christmas? Well, Jesus' birthday happening on the 25th coincides exactly with the Roman festival Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, which translates to Birthday of the Invincible Sun on December 25th, which is the date of the winter solstice in the Roman calendar. So to me, this is very notable. This is a very important coincidence that to me doesn't seem like a coincidence. The birth of the sun being replaced by the birth of the Son of God. There's some debate about whether the Christians were trying to appropriate the pagan holiday or whether it was the other way around somehow. But for me, from a logical perspective, I have to side with the pagans here since they were older and the solstice had been an important celestial event for at least 10,000 years by then. And the next thing you might be wondering is, okay, so Christ's birthday happens to be placed onto the same day, the same slot as the solstice. Why is this significant? It would seem to me that placing this new Christian holiday on the date of the solstice, which coincided with an existing Roman festival. There was even another festival that precedes that one called Saturnalia, which was in honor of the god Saturn. But by placing this on the same place, it's easy to start to create a transition, to start to create a path by which people who were previously pagan might be able to adopt this new religion because it has a lot of striking parallels with what they already believe, even down to the dates, even down to the symbolism, referring to Christ as the Son. So if you are an emperor or if you are in a position of influence and you want this religion to be able to be amalgamated into an existing one way to do that is by trying to force some similarities. So if this was put in place not by one of Jesus' disciples, not by any holy scripture or religious figures, but instead by a Roman emperor, effectively a military leader, how does that happen? What would the motivation be? Why would someone want to do that? Well, in order to know that, I guess we would have to talk to Emperor Constantine, because it was during his reign that the church formally began celebrating Christmas on December 25th in about the year 336. Because Constantine had previously issued the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity an acceptable form of religion. It was no longer outlawed with this edict. And as a Christian, some people believe that Constantine may have had the motive of weakening the established pagan celebrations by selecting this date for Christmas. And there's a little bit of confusion around this because some people think that Constantine was the one who made Christianity the religion of Rome, when in fact that was a subsequent ruler, Theodosius, if that's how his name is pronounced. And he made Catholic Christianity the official religion of the empire. And so now you have the official marriage of church and state, as I had alluded to before. And at this point, the church and the state begin dismantling previous places of worship. They start destroying pagan temples. They start replacing them with churches. They start destroying their iconography. They just launch an all-out war on pagan beliefs. And what's interesting here is that pagans traditionally didn't require you to just submit to their belief structure like Christianity did. In Christianity, the first commandment, literally number one above all other commandments, are that you shall have no other gods beside me. So it's a very, very exclusive religion, which stands in stark contrast to polytheistic pagan beliefs in which there were many gods. And even among different pagan practitioners, there was the sense that the different gods were just existing within this larger universe of gods and spirits, and it wasn't really a threat to have slightly different gods that you were worshiping. I'm sure there were still acts of violence and disagreement and war and fights that emerged on that basis, but by and large, it seems that it was pretty permissive in this way until something like Christianity comes along, where now it's very exclusive. And if you recall a previous episode where I was speaking about Scott Peck's community building method, one of the things that he observed in community building was that exclusion is perhaps the greatest enemy of community. And this is very, very ironic to me, because here we have a religion emerge where the first commandment is exclusion. And yet, somehow, that religion at that time was able to make enormous inroads. It was able to get a foothold. It was able to, the resilience of that community was beyond measure. The community was so resilient, they supported each other so well, that they were able to topple an empire. They were able to replace a polytheistic pagan religion with thousands of years of heritage with a new emergent religion. And that was in part to how supportive the community was. And this notion that was perhaps a bit different than what other cults were offering at that time, which was that God's salvation and redemption is available to anyone, not just the rich or the wealthy. In fact, the rich and the wealthy were kind of demonized in this religion. You know, Jesus kicks the moneylenders out of the temple. They say that the meek shall inherit the earth, that it would be harder for a rich man to get into heaven than to pass a camel through the eye of a needle. And at that time in Rome, there was a lot of poverty. There were a lot of people struggling. And so this was very seductive. This was a very provocative idea, because it used to be that whoever had the most riches, whoever could make the most ostentatious shows to the gods, whoever could have the most impressive sacrifices, would win the favor of the gods. And so there was a sort of elitism, there was a sort of built-in classism into the structure where the wealthy were more likely to receive God's favor. And here, one of the revolutionary things was that no, everyone is equal in the eyes of God. And when you combine that with community, when you combine that with huge amounts of evangelism, huge movements to convert, a push for literacy, and a bunch of other things that happened during early Christianity, you could kind of get a sense of why it was able to take the hold that it did. But to me, when I kept digging, I was still scratching my head a bit, and I was still thinking, yeah, but how could a new idea replace such a lasting, time-tested idea? You know, how could this monotheistic religion come in and challenge and replace this ancient polytheistic religion? And when I got to reading a bit more, I found an interesting, initially puzzling piece of information. And that is that the earliest Christian texts weren't written in Hebrew or Aramaic, which you'd expect because these are the dominant languages at that time in that place. But the Gospels and the New Testament were actually written in Greek. So this stirred a memory in me from having read Jeremy Lent's The Patterning Instinct some years ago. And if you haven't read that book, I really recommend it. It's a fascinating read. And in it, he speaks about how Christianity had its origins in Plato. And this helped explain why Christianity was able to take hold in Rome. Not so much because it was a new religion, but because it was old. These ideas were old. Plato's theory of the eternal forms play really nicely with a God who transcends time and space and exists in an eternal realm of heaven. And there's an interesting thing here about ancient Greece, because we look back to ancient Greece and we often think of them as almost superior to our own in this weird, sort of nostalgic way. You know, we look to their philosophy, their rationality, their modes of governance, the democracy, their art. We look at all of these things, but what we often overlook is the fact that they were a polytheistic pagan civilization. A lot of people don't know about the Greek mystery cults. And what I'm starting to think on this Christmas Eve is that these pagan practices, these pagan cults that were existing even before Rome in ancient Greece, also really shaped what we understand as modern Christianity. Because there are some things in Christianity that are a little bit odd when you think about them. And the one that I'm going to talk about here is the Eucharist. Now, the Eucharist, for people who may not be so religious, or for those who don't remember this word from Sunday school, it's what you receive during communion, right? It's the little flat piece of bread and optionally the wine. Sort of Christian cannibalism that's inherent in the ritual of receiving communion. And even the fact that there is a ritual around this nods back to animistic, polytheistic pagan traditions where ritual and ceremony and dance and song were so important. And all of that is on full display in ancient Greece, in these mystery cults, most notably the most famous mystery cult, the Eleusinian mysteries, where people would consume something. It could be wine, it could be bread, very similar to what they were consuming later in Rome, but these things might contain a psychedelic. They would contain some kind of plant medicine. There would be music, there would be song, dance. People would be whipped up into a state of ecstatic frenzy, where they might experience horror or anguish or, ego dissolution, bona fide psychedelic experiences that were intended to throw the participant into transcendent states, to partake of the divine. You would drink the blood or eat the body of the God and know that deity. And it could be frightening. It often was. And you would experience a sort of death and rebirth. Part of you would die. You would be in the throes of death, or at least it would feel this way. And you would emerge having learned something, changed, transformed, born again. So we see that same practice with the Eucharist in Catholic communion. You drink of the blood and eat the body of Christ to get closer to holiness. It's a ritual to remember the sacrifice of Jesus as well. So when we think about how the Greeks not just contributed to this philosophical abstraction that's necessary to conceive of something like Christianity, but we look back to the Greeks and see that they were creating rites and ceremonies that were then appropriated or translated into rituals and ceremonies that would happen later in Roman times inside of a new sect, a new cult called Christianity. It begins to explain how this religion was able to spread like wildfire, because it was taking old structures, old practices, old ceremonies, old concepts, and weaving them together into a fresh ecology, into something that would be intriguing or inviting, especially at the time. There's a certain element of luck to it, that it happened in the time and place that it did, when the Roman Empire had built such an intricate network of roads, so that once something like this came into the collective consciousness and started to take and gain popularity, it was able to be disseminated far and wide, quickly, with relative ease. And still, when we look around today, after the fall of that civilization, the Roman Empire collapsed, and still Christianity is the dominant religion on this planet. It's pretty crazy to think about that even after the collapse, the religion remains. It was that tenacious, that strong, that resilient. And it made sense logistically as well, because you didn't have to have 50 gods to pay tribute to and collect taxes on and try to organize people around. If you could just have one ruler and one god, this makes things a bureaucratic breeze. It's easy to rule, it's easy to unify people, it's easy to spread a message because it's unified. So this had an advantage over polytheistic tradition, because it was a sort of simplification. Today, still, after all this time, it's still the de facto religion for the Western world. And most of us, myself included, believe that Jesus Christ was born on December 25th, that this is established somewhere in the scripture. But it isn't. It's a sort of mysterious thing. In a way, it almost shows that pagan tradition is equally stubborn, equally tenacious, equally resilient, because Christianity wasn't able to weed these things out. It had to incorporate saints. It had to incorporate holy relics. It had to incorporate spirit possession. It had to incorporate so many things that were older than it and still continue today. So there's a weird union. There's a weird marriage between ancient polytheistic tradition and modern Christianity. And that's pretty amazing too, when I think about it. The dogs are back. There's a commotion outside. So I'm going to try to wrap this up anyway. Be good to one another. And I'll talk to you in the new year.